The final horn blast at Winterfell echoed through the ancient courtyards like a mournful cry, ripping through the frigid night air to signal that all hope had collapsed. In that moment, just as the living had begun to believe in a miracle, just as the first rays of dawn were supposed to spill onto the blood-slick ground, the dead surged forward in an unstoppable wave. They came with a single purpose: to snuff out every living soul within the walls of the Stark stronghold. No hero rose to defy them, no desperate last gambit succeeded. The combined forces of men and dragons, of warriors and common folk, cracked under the crushing might of the army of the dead. And at their head, silent and implacable, stood the Night King. With a calculated tilt of his pale, frosted visage, the Night King commanded his horde. Scores of wights moved in seamless unison, climbing over shattered battlements, crawling through collapsed towers, piling atop one another like insects determined to swarm every last breathing foe. The living had fought valiantly through the terrible hours of night, but their lines fractured. No matter how many wights were cut down, they rose again if the Night King willed it so. The White Walkers, tall and eerie in their inhuman grace, advanced behind their resurrected thralls. Ice traced patterns of dread on the stones beneath their feet. Weapons of frozen crystal clashed with steel. The sound was high and piercing, like the shriek of a winter gale, but it was accompanied by the groans and snarls of the dead. Behind them, an unholy hush seemed to drape the sky, as though the stars themselves had gone into hiding. Jon Snow, face smeared with ash and blood, tried to press forward with Longclaw in a last attempt at rallying a defense. He had once believed his destiny was written by old prophecies and ancient songs. He lunged at a pair of wights, severing limbs that fell useless to the ground, but an arrow of ice whistled past him, lodging in the breastplate of one of the northern bannermen just behind. With a grunt, Jon twisted aside and tried to drag the mortally wounded man free of the writhing mass of undead. But more were upon them. For each wight that tumbled, half a dozen took its place, snapping jaws and flailing dead hands. Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, had soared overhead for as long as she could, her remaining child, Drogon, battling the undead dragon Viserion in a dance of furious flame and ruin. But Viserion's icy breath had cracked Drogon's left wing, forcing them to land. Blood, dark and steaming, poured from the wounded dragon's flank. And though Daenerys tried once more to command a torrent of dragonfire, Viserion's withering cold overcame Drogon's failing might. The once proud black dragon sank, keening in anguish, onto the rubble below. Daenerys leaped off, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face, as she watched her last living child die. She attempted to rally the troops near her, but the shriek of Viserion tore the sky, and she knew the end was near. Her eyes found Jon in the frenzy. She raised a trembling hand, wanting to run to him, to mount some final stand, but the wights formed an unbreakable wall. They pressed upon her, forced her back until her boots slipped on blood-iced ground. Jorah Mormont's body lay not far from her, half buried beneath a heap of corpses that had once been northern soldiers. Her protectors were all gone. Arya Stark, the killer of the Night King in one prophecy, had attempted her dagger's leap in the Godswood but failed to surprise him. He had heard her footstep, had turned with a speed that defied mortal expectation, and she met the same fate as so many others. A silent slash from his ancient blade of ice. The dagger of Valyrian steel had fallen into the snow, glinting faintly, a relic of a future that would never be. Her body, pierced through by the cold power of death, was raised minutes later to become part of the swelling horde. The lone weirwood tree in the Godswood trembled in the presence of the darkness, its red leaves fluttering in a final lament. Bran Stark's watchful, pale eyes had tracked the scene. Even as the three-eyed raven, he had seen endless possibilities. Now, in this reality, he realized just how fragile fate could be. Though he tried to reach out with his powers, to halt time or direct ravens to disrupt the Night King, there was no stopping inevitability. He understood too well that this was the moment where men's illusions of victory crumbled, replaced by the stark presence of death unbound. The walls of Winterfell were torn apart from within. Giants under the thrall of the Night King brought down gatehouses, hammered through barricades. The defenders scattered, pockets of them turning to flee deeper into the castle keep. Sansa Stark, her face set in determined despair, guided the last of the civilians into the crypts beneath Winterfell, recalling some faint hope that the dead would not cross those ancient thresholds. But the crypts were hardly a refuge. The corpses of past Stark generations had already been summoned by the Night King's magic, their skeletal remnants smashing free of coffins and tombs. Screams reverberated against the cold stone walls as the living discovered that even in the deepest corners of the fortress, there was no escape. Sansa, cornered by the rousing dead of her own ancestors, fought like one who knew there was no tomorrow. A shard of dragon glass slashed across an animated skeleton's ribs, sending bone and old cloth scattering. But they were too many. It was dark chaos, torches spinning, shadows flickering, fear incarnate. She died with curses on her lips for the fate that had befallen them, her last breath stolen by the hush of the unstoppable dead. Above, the Night King advanced through the courtyard, each step as steady as the inexorable fall of winter. He sensed the presence of Bran Stark, the living embodiment of history and memory, and moved toward the entrance to the Godswood. White walkers flanked him, silent sentinels. In that final confrontation, Bran, sitting in his wheeled chair, gazed up at the creature that had haunted men for thousands of years. A tear slipped from Bran's eye, acknowledging not fear for himself but sorrow for all the realms of men. The Night King raised his hand, the edges of his form shimmering in the half-light of dawn, and in a flash of inhuman speed, ended the last witness's life. Bran's body fell from the chair, eyes wide yet unseeing. And with that, the three-eyed raven's knowledge was extinguished. The crows that circled overhead scattered, as though their link to the boy had been brutally severed. The hush that fell over Winterfell in the aftermath was unnatural, broken only by the shuffle of countless white feet and the wind's low moan. Dawn's first pale rays crept across a field of the dead, both truly dead and recently risen. Daenerys, wounded, found herself pulled to her feet by whites. She tried to scream, tried to unleash any spark of flame left in her, but there was only a cold hush inside her soul. The Night King stepped in front of her, head cocked to one side, studying her for a moment as though she were merely another relic of a doomed age. His quiet authority pressed against her mind. She fought it, trembling, but felt her will slipping. And when her eyes rolled back into her head and her skin blanched, she too joined his legion, now a white queen in shredded leathers and Targaryen sigils, an eerie testament to the house that once believed it could conquer death with fire. Jon Snow was the last to fall, mortally wounded by a swipe from an ice spear. He knelt beside the remnants of Winterfell's great hall, glaring with unbreakable hatred at the creature that had orchestrated this apocalypse. As his blood stained the snow, he kept a vice-like grip on Longclaw, wishing he had the strength to stand one more time. The Night King approached him, gave him the barest, almost curious glance, and then turned away. Jon Snow felt the surging dark come for him, felt the chill seep into his body, and realized that the living had lost. In his final moments of awareness, he prayed to the old gods, the Seven, the Lord of Light, any force that could defy this horror. But the gods were silent. When the sun rose fully, shining upon Winterfell, it exposed a realm of corpses. The glorious seat of House Stark, an unbroken line of ancient northern blood, lay in ruin. Fires smoldered, collapsed towers jutted at broken angles, rubble scattered about like an offering to some profane power. Snow and ash mingled, drifting in the frigid breeze. The army of the dead, enlarged now by every warrior who had perished overnight, stood silent, awaiting their master's command. At the center of this dreadful stillness, the Night King surveyed his conquest. Winterfell had fallen, and with its defenders broken, the path to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms lay wide open. What happened in the following days would be recounted only in nightmares, if there were any left living to dream. The Night King did not rest. He marched south, leading an ever-growing tide of undead. Scouts from House Glover or House Manderley never returned from their missions, having been added to the ranks of the whites. The great northern houses, scattered and leaderless, fell like dominoes in front of an unstoppable winter. The ancient keeps that had once stood proudly amid the snow-laden forests were reduced to silent bastions of death. No ravens brought word of hope or strategy. Even if they tried, the Night King's presence disrupted the very magic that might have delivered warnings in time. At Moat Cailin, the narrow choke point into the north, the forces left behind by the living attempted a desperate stand. They hoped that perhaps the marshy terrain and the old fortress walls would slow the horde. But the dead did not require rest, nor food, nor warmth. Night and day bled into one another as the defenders, clinging to the ramparts, fired flaming arrows and tossed barrels of burning pitch at the never-ending ranks. For a few hours, the living thought they might hold. Then, in the dead of night, the White Walkers unleashed an unnatural storm. Wind howled, carrying shards of ice that extinguished the braziers and froze the defenders' fingers on their bowstrings. Shivering, panicking, they watched as the Whites marched straight across the wetlands, unstoppable. Moat Cailin fell before dawn. The living had no chance. After the walls were breached, the great houses of Westeros learned of the doom that crept closer. But communications were in tatters. The Night King advanced quickly, faster than anyone had anticipated. Every refugee from the north carried the same message. Winterfell was gone. The combined might of the Starks, Targaryens, and their allies had been snuffed out. Panic seeped through the riverlands and beyond. Unprepared for the unholy winter swirling at the edges of their lands, many lords simply fled, their small folk left behind to fend for themselves. But some tried to organize a last line of defense. House Tully gathered its banners at Riverrun, hoping the red fork of the trident would serve as a natural barrier. Yet the rivers themselves began to freeze under the relentless cold that emanated from the army of the dead. Brienne of Tarth, though battered and heartsick, tried to bolster the knights and foot soldiers. She rallied them with memories of honorable stands, with the knowledge that they had to protect the innocents. But the tale of Winterfell's fall hung like a pall of despair over even the bravest hearts. News of the dragon's defeat had taken all illusions of advantage from them. They no longer believed in any magical edge. Courage there was, but it was the courage of those who fight because they have no other choice, not the courage of certain victory. Soon, the horizon darkened with the silhouettes of undead. They approached, a sea of whites across miles of open field. The defenders at Riverrun saw the terrible sight from the castle walls. Banners of all northern houses drifting among the ranks of the dead, a ghastly pageantry of the living's worst nightmares. Among them, ghosts of once great warriors marched with eyes glazed and unseeing, bound by the Night King's will. The battle that commenced was short but brutal. Cavalry charges disintegrated against the mass of whites. The riders pulled from their horses. Flaming projectiles were hurled from catapults, scorching hundreds at a time, but it was not enough to stem the tide. And all the while, White Walkers strode through the chaos like regal phantoms, unsmiling, unleashing blades of frost upon any who dared stand against them. Brienne fought fiercely, cutting down whites in a flurry of well-aimed strokes. But even her skill could not circumvent the single misstep that left her pinned by the spear of a monstrous white giant. She died with her sword still raised, a final protest against the onrushing darkness. When Riverrun's gates were finally battered down, the Tullus, along with whatever knights had pledged to protect the fortress, were already lost. The keep was filled with screams that echoed for a short while, then plunged into silence. Another ancient stronghold joined the ranks of lifeless fortresses in the Night King's inexorable campaign. Fresh waves of whites emerged from Riverrun's battered walls, swollen with the ranks of those who had tried to defend it. Next, the unstoppable horde set its sights on King's Landing. Cersei Lannister, who had once watched the war in the north with cold detachment, was at last forced to confront the terror she had dismissed. The threat was no longer theoretical. The north had fallen, the riverlands had collapsed, and no allies remained to buffer the capital from the oncoming darkness. She had the Golden Company at her disposal, and the remnants of the Lannister and Crownlander forces. But she lacked dragons, and her cunning political plays now seemed inconsequential in the face of an ancient evil that cared nothing for negotiation or strategy. Jaime Lannister, once her stalwart champion, was gone. Killed in the chaos that erupted while traveling from the north, or perhaps taken by the dead. No one knew for certain. All Cersei could do was order every resource poured into fortifying King's Landing. Walls rose higher, scorpions and ballistae were placed at key vantage points on the battlements, and citizens were conscripted to throw pitch and boiling oil. The city teetered on the edge of desperation. Refugees who had escaped from other regions choked the streets, turning them into overcrowded warrens where famine and disease ran wild. The Gold Cloaks struggled to maintain order, and riots broke out nightly as people fought for the last scraps of bread. Cersei's order to seal the gates against further refugees only fueled chaos. But there was little time for humanitarian concerns, for the army of the dead drew closer every day, bringing with it a biting cold that settled over the Crownlands, wilting crops and freezing streams. At last, the Outriders arrived with news that the undead were visible on the horizon beyond the Blackwater. Daylight discovered the shimmering line of frost as it slowly spread across once temperate fields. The Golden Company, famed sellswords from across the narrow sea, took up their positions outside the city walls, forming neat ranks of professional soldiers. Their elephants, though uneasy, were stationed to provide support, and their captains marched with stoic expressions. Yet even their discipline quavered when they finally witnessed the scale of the threat. An endless legion of silent, pitiless corpses. At the center of the host was the Night King, accompanied by white walkers that exuded a dense cold vapor, as if they carried the heart of winter in their chests. The siege of King's Landing was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was an event of cosmic inevitability. The sun rose, but its rays brought no warmth. The dead approached slowly, like a coming tide, and then crashed upon the living with unstoppable force. Swords cut down the front ranks only to have them stand up again moments later, resurrected by the Night King's dreadful might. On Cersei's command, barrels of wildfire had been hidden across the fields outside the city, and when the Whites moved into range, the alchemists ignited them. Enormous green flames roared, incinerating thousands of undead in a spectacle that lit the sky with emerald fury. An unearthly roar went up as entire swaths of the dead were reduced to ash, and for a moment, the defenders of King's Landing dared to hope that maybe the unstoppable tide could be halted. But the green inferno began to die down, and the dead kept coming from behind the scorched ranks. The Night King himself remained aloof, unaffected by the flames. Viserion, the undead dragon, circled overhead, unleashing blasts of crystalline ice that shattered trebuchets and froze entire lines of defenders. Scorpions were fired into the sky, desperate to take the undead dragon out, but Viserion evaded them with an uncanny speed, or else the ice breath froze the bolts mid-flight. The terrifying screech of the undead dragon echoed across the city's walls, sowing panic among the already trembling soldiers. When the army of the dead finally reached the gates of King's Landing, the Golden Company found themselves locked in brutal, close-quarters combat. Elephants stampeded, crushing Whites underfoot, their drivers screaming commands to keep them from panicking. The sellswords fought well, discipline was all they had, and they refused to break. But bit by bit, the dead overwhelmed them. The elephants were pulled down by masses of undead that clung to their flanks like relentless insects. High towers of the city's outer defenses caved in when ice lances were hurled by White Walkers. King's Landing's famous walls, which had repelled countless sieges over centuries, began to buckle. Desperate, Cersei unleashed the last of her wildfire stores, scattered throughout the city's lower levels. She cared little about the potential for collateral damage, for in her eyes, it was better to see the city burn than fall to an enemy. Fountains of green flame shot skyward in multiple districts, incinerating clusters of Whites but also igniting city blocks, dooming thousands of civilians. Those trapped within the capital found themselves torn between the horrors of a monstrous foe outside the gates and the catastrophe of green fire consuming everything from within. The city descended into chaos, and King's Landing's own downfall became inevitable. In the midst of the carnage, the Night King appeared atop Viserion, circling over the Red Keep. With a dreadful roar, the undead dragon spewed its freezing breath, turning entire rooftops to frost-laden ruin. The Red Keep's parapets cracked under the assault. High in her throne room, Cersei sat with wildfire blazing on all sides, refusing to flee, her eyes bright with madness and terror. When the great windows exploded in a swirl of ice and glass, whites poured in, and White Walkers strode regally across the marble floors. She made no attempt to run. She only clutched the arms of the Iron Throne, as if her rule could outlast this final assault. A monstrous figure, perhaps once the Mountain, or some abomination resurrected in a different form, tried to protect her, but a White Walker shattered the undead knight with a single thrust of an ice spear. In that final moment, Cersei locked eyes with the Night King, who had glided into the throne room behind his minions. She gave him a twisted smile, perhaps from madness, perhaps from sheer defiance. His expression never changed. He lifted one hand, and the shards of ice that emanated from his pale palm speared her body where she sat. Thusly, dead the last ruling Lannister, in a conflagration of ice and green fire that devoured the Red Keep from within. The death of King's Landing was complete. Wildfire explosions gutted entire quarters of the city, toppling spires and ramparts, setting the harbor alight with unholy green flames. The screams of the dying mixed with the shrieks of the undead, until finally the entire city was drowned in carnage and terror. By dawn, the once great capital of the Seven Kingdoms was a ruined mausoleum. The survivors who cowered in cellars or among the city's labyrinthine streets soon found their fates sealed. If they did not perish in the flames, they were claimed by the endless hordes of whites. Only blackened, broken walls remained, looming over an ashen wasteland. By then, the unstoppable winter had swept across the continent. From the Vale of Arryn to the Stormlands, frost claimed the fields. Forests stood silent under sheets of ice. The roads were choked with refugee caravans that never reached safety. Each day more corpses left behind in the snow. Each corpse eventually added to the army that advanced without pause. The Night King's purpose was not conquest in the mortal sense. It was extinction. Yet he continued systematically, leading his legions to every corner of Westeros, ensuring that no pocket of life remained. Dragons were gone, heroes were dead, and so were the old songs that once spoke of salvation. Few pockets of resistance lingered. In the Vale, high up in the Eyrie, the denizens believed their fortress might remain unreachable. But the unrelenting storms brought by the White Walkers buried the mountain passes. The Vale's defenders found themselves starving, isolated, and cut off from any potential reinforcements. Eventually, when the army of the dead arrived, guided by a force of White Walkers who seemed to defy mere mortal geography, the Eyrie's famed defenses proved futile. A horde of whites scaled the mountainsides, their frozen fingers clinging to sheer drops, an impossible feat for any living climber. Those inside, faced with an enemy that could appear from any direction, were quickly overwhelmed. Robin Arryn, the last of his line, was found cowering in the high hall, still in his bedgown, clutching a bough he could barely string. It did him no good. The night soon swallowed the Vale just as it had swallowed the rest of the realm. Storm's End, once the proud seat of House Baratheon, also tried to hold out. Barricaded behind thick walls, the defenders watched as hurricanes of freezing rain and monstrous thunderclouds battered their fortress. The sea itself seemed to rebel. Waves smashed against the cliffs and the castle's foundations, but the army of the dead needed no navy to approach. They simply marched, implacable, along the coastline or emerged from the frigid surf, wading through the boiling foam. Many who saw it claimed it was as though the dead walked on the seafloor, unaffected by the crushing depths. There was nowhere left untouched by the Night King's dominion. When the wards of Storm's End eventually snapped like wet kindling under the onslaught of giant whites and White Walker magic, the last flicker of resistance in the Stormlands was snuffed out. Dorne, far to the south, hoped its deserts and scorching sun might stand as a natural barrier against the encroaching cold. But the cold was not natural, and the unstoppable push of the undead recognized no boundary of climate. The dunes of Dorne became fields of brittle frost, shimmering bizarrely under a sun that gave light but no warmth. Prince Quentin Martell, who had inherited the title upon the demise of nearly all his kin, struggled to rally every Dornish house. They prepared to fight in the passes of the Red Mountains, to use guerrilla tactics from desert strongholds. Yet each skirmish whittled away at the living. Every fallen warrior was replaced by a white puppet, swelling the undead ranks. When the White Walkers arrived with storms in their wake, swirling gusts of icy sand that scoured the flesh from bones, the Dornish lines collapsed. Sunspear, the proud seat of Martell power, was consumed in the swirling white. The red scorpions on their banners were soon as pale and drained as the land itself. Across the narrow sea, rumors spread that Westeros was lost to a never-ending winter. Merchant ships that braved the crossing found only silent, ice-bound harbors and deserted ports. Any who ventured too far inland never returned. The free cities, once reliant on trade from Westeros, heard tales of an undead legion numbering in the millions, a perpetual twilight that had descended on the continent. Some said that even the seas began to freeze along the western shores, as the Night King's power spread outward. Terrified, many in Essos fortified their cities, praying that the waters of the narrow sea would be enough to halt the White Walkers' expansion. Still, the memory of ancient legends whispered that if the long night had returned, perhaps the entire world was in peril. Time began to lose meaning under an unchanging overcast sky. The sun rose and set, but its light was wan and pale. In the Seven Kingdoms, the living dwindled to almost none. Frozen towns dotted the landscape, their inhabitants gone, replaced by the silent roving presence of the undead. Castle after castle stood as an eerie monument to a kingdom that once was. The farmland that had fed millions now lay barren under permafrost. Rivers were ice-locked, roads turned to glassy sheets that no living foot would ever tread again. In the north, the Night King made his final seat of power in the remains of Winterfell, an ironic fate for the ancestral home of House Stark. But truly, his dominion extended from the shivering sea to the sunset sea, from the Gift to the southernmost deserts of Dorne. The army of the dead stood sentinel in every abandoned holdfast, on every bridge, by every crossroad, keeping watch though there were none left to conquer. An everlasting hush cloaked the realm. There was no wind chime of laughter, no clang of blacksmith's hammer, no cry of hawkers in bustling markets. Winter reigned, absolute and unchallenged. High above these silent expanses, Viserion, still bound to the Night King, occasionally took flight, patrolling the skies, an omen of unstoppable cold. Some said that on still nights, one could hear the distant flapping of dead wings, a solemn reminder that even the dragons had succumbed to this final darkness. Where once soared living, fiery might, only an echo of frost remained. From time to time, pockets of stubborn survivors attempted to hide. Some took to remote islands off the coasts, others to secret mountain caves. They scratched out meager existences, always on the brink of starvation, living in perpetual fear that the whites would find them. Over the years, some formed ragged bands that prayed to old gods anew for deliverance, but it never came. Their children grew up haunted by tales of White Walkers with glowing blue eyes, unstoppable in their quest to extinguish life. Fires burned low in these hidden refuges, and hope was kept to a thin, flickering thread. Occasionally, the survivors would speak in hushed tones of the prophecy that once claimed a hero would defeat the darkness. Azor Ahai, they whispered, remembering half-forgotten stories about flaming swords and the triumph of light. But that champion had either failed to appear or perished in the calamity at Winterfell. Some argued that Jon Snow had been that champion and that destiny had faltered or had never truly been real. Others blamed Daenerys Targaryen for letting her dragons fall. Still others said that men's betrayals and petty squabbles had doomed them long before the dead arrived. Yet in the end, the truth was simple and stark. The living were not strong enough, not united enough, not prepared for a threat older and more relentless than all their petty crowns. Fate, it seemed, had never been on their side. Decades passed, or perhaps centuries. Time was lost in the perpetual gloom. The seat of power that was once the Iron Throne lay in corroded shards within the Red Keep's collapsed Great Hall. An unnatural, near-eternal winter coated the continent, an ice age brought forth by the malignant power of the White Walkers. Far to the north, where the wall once stood, the glaciers extended even farther, as if the night had swallowed the land entirely. The concept of kingdoms became meaningless. No kingdom of man existed anymore, only the silent domain of the dead. And through it all, the Night King endured, tall, with crystalline horns crowning his head, his visage forever set in that inscrutable mask. There were whispers, in the last gasps of the living, that he had once been a mortal man, cursed and shaped by the children of the forest during an age of desperation. Whatever spark of humanity once dwelled in him was now as extinguished as the sun's warmth in these frozen wastes. He stood at the top of Winterfell's shattered battlements or soared on the back of Viserion across the silent lands, an unwavering sentinel of ice and death. No living soul remained to challenge him. The fate of men was sealed. What, then, was the nature of his existence now? The White Walkers did not eat, did not sleep, did not crave. They existed in a static, eternal hush. If there was triumph in the Night King's icy heart, it did not show. His was a victory without joy, a conquest without spoils, a dominion of emptiness. The landscape below lay locked in an eternal hush, with only the restless shadows of the dead to keep him company. In the riverlands, the trident lay frozen, an unbroken sheet of white that shone like polished quartz beneath the pale sky. The towers of Harrenhal, once imposing in their ruin, now stood silent, encrusted in layers of frost as thick as stone. The halls of the Vale, the deserts of Dorne, the golden fields of the Reach, none escaped the creeping, silent cold. Even Old Town, the repository of the realm's knowledge, had fallen. The great library was sealed in ice, its tomes frozen shut, thousands of years of lore now silent, unreadable, lost forever to this new, unending age of winter. In some corners of Essos, sailors or adventurers still told stories of a pale specter drifting across the narrow sea, as though the dead might one day reach even their shores. Some spoke of the long night as a cyclical curse. They wondered if there might come a day, some impossibly distant future, when the grip of the Night King would weaken, when perhaps the world would thaw. But that remained only speculation, a dim spark in a realm overshadowed by the knowledge that the living had once tried and utterly failed to stop the relentless tide. For in Westeros, everything was stagnant, as though time had congealed in the frost. The Whites patrolled the roads, filling the hush with the scrape of bone against bone, the rustle of decaying leather, the occasional clank of a rusted sword. The White Walkers, centuries old, moved without haste or purpose now that their ultimate goal was achieved. They were caretakers of a silent realm. No mortal eyes remained to see them or fear them, no hearts left to tremble at their approach. If one searched among the snowdrifts and shattered ruins, one could find tokens of the past. A direwolf sigil chipped into a broken shield, the filigreed handle of a Valyrian steel dagger, a ring embossed with a lion's head half buried in the ice. These relics told a story of the 7 great houses that once vied for power in a land that thrived on green fields and warm summers. Now, they were nothing but faint echoes in a wilderness of ice, their legacies undone by the final, indisputable conqueror. Of House Stark, Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Tyrell, Martell, Tully, only silent whites remained, pawns in a cosmic endgame. Their names were as lost as the voices that once spoke them. On particularly still nights, the wind would sometimes swirl through Winterfell's courtyard, dislodging shards of ice from collapsed beams or sending a few stray leaves scuttling across the snowy ground. It was as if the ghosts of the past tried to stir, to remind the world of a time when families dined in the Great Hall, when children sparred with wooden swords in the training yard, when the crypts below were just a resting place for honored ancestors instead of the cradle of undead monstrosities. But the hush would return quickly, stifling any memory of warmth or life. South, near what had once been the Blackwater Bay, the remains of ships stuck in the frozen harbor like grotesque sculptures. Their sails were tattered, their masts angled at improbable slants. The chain that once protected the bay in times of siege was half buried under ice, a pointless relic. The streets beyond were unrecognizable as the vibrant King's Landing. The grand walkways and monuments had collapsed. The dragon pit was an unholy ruin, its dome shattered, half filled with snowdrifts. The skeletons of dragons inside turned to twisted lumps of ice-encrusted bone. The Red Keep's highest towers stood like jagged fangs silhouetted against a colorless sky. Where once King Aegon's conquest had begun, where once countless Targaryen, Baratheon, and Lannister kings had ruled, nothing was left but endless quiet. And in the darkest hours, one could wander the ghostly corridors, if any living being had remained to do so, and see the Night King gliding through the Red Keep, his cloak whispering on the frozen tiles, as if surveying the seat of human ambition. He had ended all ambitions. What was left for him? The question had no answer. He existed as a force of nature, not a man who needed justification. The White Walkers were the winter incarnate, an ancient impetus to reset a world that had grown chaotic and filled with human failings. They offered an order of stillness, a hush that would never be shattered by war or the petty rivalry of kings. Thus it went for years upon years. The few enclaves of hidden survivors either starved, froze, or were eventually discovered and assimilated into the legions of the dead. Their stories disappeared with them, the final sparks of humanity fading into that boundless frost. Occasionally, from some vantage on a remote coastline or a mountainside, a group might attempt to build a ship or scale the savage peaks in hopes of escape. But the storms unleashed by the White Walkers thwarted them, burying their efforts in avalanches, ripping their sails in howling gales. Survival was an illusion in this new age. So ended the Seven Kingdoms. Once, the realm had known golden summers lasting years, steeped in legend and plenty. Great lords plotted and feasted, jousted and waged war for crowns, forging alliances, betraying oaths, living, in short, as mortal men have always lived. But beneath their mortal struggles, an older power slumbered beyond the wall, waiting for the moment to reclaim the land of the living. The warnings had been written in old texts, recited by the dwindling children of the forest, etched into the weirwood faces. Yet men, in their arrogance, believed they had eons before the threat emerged again, or that prophecy would deliver a savior in due time. The long night fell upon them all, and no champion rose to banish it. In the end, the only victors were the forces of death and ice. The continent lay lifeless, locked in perpetual winter, a testament to what happens when old evils are underestimated and mortal pride blinds entire civilizations to their peril. Among the silent fields of white, the only movement was the slow, methodical patrol of the undead. Their footprints left no warmth, their passing no disturbance. They required neither reason nor reward for their endless watch. There came a day, if day it could be called, when the Night King descended the steps of Winterfell, passing through the courtyard under a sky the color of slate, and left the castle behind, leading a processional of White Walkers and Whites across the snow-laden roads. Perhaps he had sensed some last pocket of life or simply chose to wander his dominion. Viserion soared overhead, a pale silhouette against the clouds. They traveled for many leagues, passing ruined holdfasts and farmland swallowed by frost. No breathing soul stirred. When they reached the old crossroads near the inn that once stood, the Night King paused. The inn was a sagging ruin, its roof caved, icicles as thick as spears dangling from the beams. A sign, half broken, lay face down in the snow. Once, travelers might have found hot bread and salt here, might have shared stories around a hearth. Now it was silent, as though it had never housed laughter. The Night King surveyed it, emotionless, and pressed on. Beyond lay roads that led to the Riverlands, to the Vale, or even to the Westerlands if one kept going far enough. All were the same now, paths through a dead kingdom. Through the Westerlands, the army of the dead picked its path, sometimes overshadowed by the mountain ranges, sometimes traversing the dismal plains. The gold mines of Casterly Rock, if they still existed, lay silent, and the proud fortress there was battered open. The Lannister lion flags had long been torn from the battlements, replaced by scuttling whites or left to rot in the snow. The ocean beside it was rimmed with ice along the shoreline, its waves subdued in the face of an unnatural chill. Finally, the procession turned inland, crossing stony roads that once hummed with trade caravans. Their journey took them further and further, through crumbling villages and farmland that had not known a harvest in generations. It was as if the Night King was revisiting the entire tapestry of Westeros, ensuring no life dared remain. Each day was as gray as the one before, each night as cold and still. Time itself had no meaning here. It was an endless repetition of footsteps on snow, of blank-eyed wights shuffling behind their silent monarch. Occasionally, Viserion's roar would echo overhead, cracking the stillness. The undead dragons circled, scanning the land for any flicker of warmth. Finding none, it settled on a jagged peak or perched atop a tower, watching with blue fire leaking from its maw. This was the new world, an empire of ghosts. The ephemeral hush was broken only by the swirling wind, which carried the faint lament of all who had once dared to breathe and hope. In hidden recesses across the sea, stories would be told, legends of a land that fell to eternal night, a grim fate cautioning other realms never to forget the ancient enemy. But the knowledge of how to fight them effectively, the alliances once formed for that purpose, the dragons that might have turned the tide, all of that was gone. Time in Essos moved forward, but the events of Westeros became myth. Perhaps, in 1,000 years, some intrepid band of explorers would sail across the narrow sea to see if the rumors were true. They would step onto frozen shores and find a desolation locked under permafrost, wonder if men ever lived there at all. Through it all, the Night King endured like a living statue of ice, an immortal presence overseeing a kingdom of the dead. No longer would spring or summer or autumn grace these lands. The unending winter had conquered every castle, every city, every heart, and the cost was total. The great houses were not merely defeated, they were erased from the annals of the living. No new songs would be sung of them, only silent monuments of frost. If there was any record kept, it was in the mind of the Night King himself, an indifferent witness to the ruin he had wrought. It is said that in the far north, near the place where the wall once stood, an ancient weirwood still remained, its bark white, eyes red with sap. On nights when the moon was full, the wind seemed to blow through its branches in a mournful song, as if the tree lamented the world that once thrived. No ravens perched on it, there were no ravens left. Yet those branches occasionally creaked, as if disturbed by some flicker of memory, perhaps the last echo of the magic of the children of the forest. The Night King might have passed it by at some point, unheeding, for he had no need of memory or reflection. He was the end of all stories. Thus, the final fate of Westeros was sealed by the Night King's victory at Winterfell. From that single tragedy, the darkness spread to every holdfast and hamlet, every shore and mountain. Heroes died, prophecies failed, and ancient powers slumbered instead of rising to the world's defense. Without a champion to pierce the heart of winter, the entire realm succumbed to stillness and cold, until no beating heart remained to recount what had happened. There was no one left to bury the dead. Graves and mausoleums had been rendered moot, replaced by a legion of unliving forms that needed no rest. Great halls that once rang with laughter stood forever in silence. And if a single flake of snow drifted onto a weathered helmet lying in the courtyard of a ruined castle, no living hand would brush it away. The dead had conquered all. The Night King had no need for crowns, no interest in glory. He was a force beyond mortal understanding, fulfilling a purpose as old as the first chill night of creation. To end the living, to bring absolute winter. While men had believed themselves masters of the world, forging alliances, building monuments, dreaming of prosperity, an ancient chill had bided its time. And when the hour came, it found them unprepared, too fractured to unite in earnest until it was far too late. So the realm froze, and in that hush of endless cold, the unstoppable winter reigned unopposed. The only testament to the once great civilization of Westeros was a vast, sprawling ruin locked in ice, haunted by wights that trudged without complaint or question. The wheel of mortal politics was broken not by a benevolent conqueror, but by death incarnate. Thus did the 7 proud kingdoms vanish like a whisper in a storm, and in the heart of that silent storm stood the Night King, unmoving, unbreathing, an eternal sentinel presiding over an aftermath of absolute stillness. His legacy a kingdom of utter and complete emptiness, the final hush that devoured every song and every dream. The wind that swept across Westeros's frozen plains now carried no living sense, only the faint, bitter tang of ancient ice. In the aftermath of the Night King's total victory, the entire continent lay sealed beneath a millstone sky. Where once seasons cycled and fields bore wheat and barley, there remained only bleak expanses of white. Ruin was everywhere, silent and unending. In countless villages, doorways gaped open onto streets crusted with permafrost. Castles that had housed proud banners stood gutted, their ramparts broken, their courtyards filled with drifts of wind-blown snow. There were no crows to circle overhead, no wolves to prowl in the forest. No songbird called at dawn, only the whisper of ceaseless winter. The Night King's army had scattered across the 7 kingdoms, more an encircling presence than a single host. Whites patrolled roads and watchtowers with mindless diligence, and pale white walkers roamed like eerie wardens, lords of a realm devoid of life. In the far north, at the shell of Winterfell, the Night King's presence lingered most often, though he would vanish at times, traveling on the back of his undead dragon to survey his conquest. Some nights, unnatural storm clouds would gather at the horizon, pulsing with an icy luminosity that gave no warmth, yet lit the plains enough for any stray hidden eyes to see the silhouettes of whites, rank upon rank, gliding over the snow. For though the living had been purged from nearly every holdfast and city, a handful of survivors still lurked at the ragged edges of the continent, clinging to existence in the remotest corners. Their hearts were battered by sorrow, their faith in old prophecies long undone, but some spark of primal determination kept them breathing. Others, across the narrow sea in Essos, had glimpsed the undead monarchy's power from afar and wondered if the threat might one day push beyond the straits. Yet the dawn age told of the first long night lasting generations. If that old dread had truly returned, it might last centuries, perhaps even forever. Beneath the hush of drifting snow, a story continued to unfold. The story of those few men and women who refused to die, who scuttled between ruined hamlets or huddled in high passes behind collapsed rubble, gathering scraps of memory to keep themselves sane. Far in the southwestern reaches of Westeros, near the edge of the Sunset Sea, the farmland and roads had frozen solid, but the ocean currents still churned near the coastline, resisting the total encroachment of ice. On a rocky promontory that jutted into the sea, a lighthouse once guided fishing vessels to safe harbor. Now that lighthouse was a makeshift shelter for 4 survivors. Alice, a fisher's daughter with fierce green eyes. Tom, a once knightly retainer whose sword arm bore the scars of white claws. Garen, a graying smuggler from the Stormlands, and a young girl named Brella, orphaned during the sack of King's Landing, who refused to speak since witnessing the horrors unleashed by the Night King. They had come to this lighthouse by chance, stumbling upon it while fleeing whites that roamed the shell of Lannisport. The wind had been too violent to sail west, so they'd sought refuge in the tower. It offered a singular advantage. It was isolated, accessible only by a narrow pathway chiseled into the coastal cliffs. The whites seldom ventured here, perhaps because the swirling water near the base gave them no easy approach. Inside, the group maintained a single hearth fire in what had once been the keeper's living quarters. Smoke rose through a cracked flue. Food was scarce, only dried fish and meager stores of old grains. They dared not fish openly for fear the whites might see the living stir upon the shoreline. On one of those seemingly endless gray evenings, Alice knelt by the hearth, feeding the flames with driftwood. Tom stood watch at the arrow-slit window, gazing through salted, grimy glass at the sea's dark surface. The clouds overhead hung low, bruised with the promise of more snow. Garen sat cross-legged, his back to a damp wall, rummaging through a satchel of supplies he'd salvaged from a shipwreck. Little Brella tucked herself against his side, face hidden by a cloak. Alice's voice was soft but carried in the hush. "We can't stay here forever." Tom glanced back. He was a tall man, hair gone prematurely white from fear and malnourishment, and the fur cloak he wore looked half-rotted. His eyes, though dulled by constant dread, still held the kernel of a knight's protective instincts. "Where else is safer?" Alice pressed her chapped lips tight. "Nowhere's truly safe," she said. "But if we keep to the shoreline, we might find a cove with a boat intact. If we can cross the sea—" She trailed off, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "There's talk that the cold's spreading beyond the narrow sea," Garen muttered. "But maybe the summer sea is still open south of Dorne." "Dorne's gone," Tom said quietly. He had tried traveling that direction months ago, only to discover the deserts claimed by drifting ice dunes. "I saw it. The Night King's shadow is there, too, along the coast. I do not know how far south his power can reach, but I'd not risk it. Travel on land, and we'll end up among the whites." Garen's smuggler eyes flickered at the mention of ships. "I was never much of a fisherman. I dealt in cargo, wine, saffron, stolen goods when coin was short." He sighed. "But if we found a sturdy enough boat, perhaps the current would carry us west. Some say there are islands to the far west uncharted. Or maybe we sail around the southern coast to Essos. 1,000 leagues of open water is better than waiting here." Alice stared into the flames. It was the same conversation they'd circled back to for weeks, a sign they were all losing their hold on time. She said nothing. Brella's small fingers clung to Garen's sleeve, trembling. The girl had not uttered a word in many moons. Sometimes, in her sleep, she whimpered, as if she relived the day she'd been parted from her family in King's Landing, amid whites and wildfire. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. A swirl of wind rattled the shutters. Then Tom exhaled. "All right, tomorrow at dawn we'll scout for a boat again. We can search the beaches south of here. If we don't find one, we return before nightfall." No one argued. There was no fight left to be had. Night came in an extended swirl of swirling flurries. Tom dozed fitfully, sword near at hand. Alice kept watch, though she was bleary-eyed with fatigue. Garen slept with one eye open, leaning back against the wall with Brella in the crook of his arm. The only constant was the dull ache of cold that even the meager fire could not dispel. They woke to the pale gray light that passed for morning these days. The four shared a silent meal of stale bread and flakes of smoked fish. Then, hearts pounding with tension, they descended from the lighthouse, picking their way along the hazardous cliff path. The sea crashed below, flecked with ice. Creeping through the coastal brush, they approached an old cove that might once have moored fishing vessels. A thin layer of snow covered the rocky beach, and beyond it was a tangle of piers, half collapsed from storms. No sign of movement. Still, every breath felt stolen. Any moment, a white patrol could appear on the ridge. They found 2 small rowboats, both battered, with hulls marred by broken planks. Neither looked seaworthy enough for a long voyage. With sinking hearts, they pushed onward, searching until midday for any craft that might float. Over and over, they met only with evidence of ruin. The gulls that used to roost along these cliffs were gone. The hush was so profound that the crunch of each footstep carried like thunder. Eventually, they had to retreat to the lighthouse or risk being caught out when night and the whites came. That evening, as the four huddled again near the hearth, a heaviness settled upon them. If they could not find a seaworthy vessel soon, their scant supplies would run out. The land, as far as they knew, was no refuge. They pressed on like this for days, searching new coves, rummaging through the wreckage of old fishing huts, but never did they see another living soul. The only footprints they found that weren't their own were those of whites, spaced in neat, unfeeling lines along the ridges, as though the dead had marched and then marched again in a tireless circuit. At last, in the shell of a small harbor further south, once a modest anchorage for local craft, Tom and Alice discovered a miracle of sorts. A single-masted vessel, half-dragged onto the beach, battered but apparently intact. The wood was spongy in places, though not fully rotten. Its mast needed a new sail, and the keel's boards would require patching, but it might float if they worked quickly. They returned at sunset to gather Garen and Brella, their eyes wide with something akin to hope. Garen, the smuggler, looked the boat over with a practiced eye, lips pursed, as if tasting the salt air. "We'll need to seal these planks," he murmured. "Rotted from the water line upward, but it's not beyond saving." If we can't find pitch, we might use pine resin or something similar. That night, they carried what supplies they had down from the lighthouse. It was risky, leaving the relative safety of the cliff tower, but the chance of escape overshadowed their fears. They set up a hidden camp near the boat, carefully camouflaging the site from any passers-by. Though passers-by in these times usually meant the dead. They labored for 2 days, searching old storehouses for nails, tar, scraps of cloth. Each sunrise felt like a borrowed hour. Brella helped in small ways, handing tools or fetching driftwood. Garin used his knowledge of ships to patch the hull with scavenged planks. Tom and Alice took turns on guard duty. Each night, they listened for the telltale scrape of undead feet or the hush of a White Walker's presence. On the dawn of the 3rd day, the sky seemed ominously clear. The cold was sharper than usual, as if the air itself were tightening its grip. Alice woke early, shivering under threadbare blankets, to find the boat nearly ready. It lay angled in the shallows, half afloat at high tide. The new sail they'd pieced together, stitched from old netting and cloak scraps, hung from the mast like a wounded banner, but it might catch the wind. As they dragged the boat the last few feet into deeper water, a distant cry sent ice through their veins. Tom froze, straining to hear. It was not the shriek of an undead dragon. No, they all knew that terrible call too well. This was the raw, ragged scream of a woman. A living woman. They exchanged glances. Could it be a lure? A trap? Whites themselves did not scream that way, but some White Walkers had been known to manipulate illusions of sound or cunning tactics. The scream came again, weaker. Without speaking, Tom and Alice grabbed their weapons. Tom's battered longsword, Alice's long knife. Garin warned, "Be quick. We can't risk losing the tide." Brella remained by his side, eyes wide as she clutched a length of rope. Creeping toward the source of the sound, Tom and Alice climbed over a ridge of coastal rock. They found themselves overlooking a shattered road that led inland. On that road lay a figure. Even at a distance, it was clear she was in dire shape, crawling across the snow. "We should leave her," Alice whispered, voice unsteady. "If she's been bitten or wounded by whites." But Tom was already moving toward the woman. A knight's oath might have meant nothing in this dead world, but it still shaped him. He couldn't watch someone die without trying to help. As they descended, they saw the woman's injuries. A savage gash across her abdomen, her clothing torn and soaked in blood. She wore the remnants of a tattered tunic bearing a faint sign of some lesser house from the Reach, though unrecognizable beneath grime. Her skin was pallid, lips cracked from exposure. She gazed up with terrified eyes. "Help, please," she whispered, the words rasping. Tom knelt. Alice hovered behind him, scanning for threats. "Who did this to you?" Tom asked. Whites," the woman croaked. "They found us on the road. My companions gone." She coughed, a wet, ragged sound. Are you real?" Tom gently lifted her, wincing at the warmth of blood seeping through his gloves. Alice stood guard, turning slow circles, heart pounding. She saw no undead approaching, but the hush of the land felt too deep, as though the wind itself held its breath. "We have to try," Tom said to Alice, his voice low. "She's alive." Alice glanced at the woman's wounds, set her jaw. "She'll need bandages and hot water at least, or she won't make it through the night." Together, they half-carried, half-dragged the stranger back to the beach. Garin's eyes widened at the sight of her. Brella retreated behind him, scared of what this newcomer might bring. They did what they could. A small fire, strips of cloth from their own precious supply. The woman slipped in and out of consciousness, murmuring about the shining men and ice spears. She gave her name only once. Maris of House, then a cough drowned the words. Blood stained the sand. An hour later, with the tide creeping outward, Tom and Garin stood at the bow of the patched boat, pushing it deeper into the water. They knew if they waited too long, the next tide might come after nightfall. That was no good. A patrol of whites might appear at any moment. Maris lay moaning softly near the mast, propped up on sacks of old netting. Alice crouched beside her, pressing a wadded cloth to the woman's wound. Brella, wide-eyed and silent, clung to the edge of the boat. "The boat won't handle rough waters," Garen muttered. "But the current's calmer if we move west. Maybe we can skirt the coast, then angle south. If the weather holds, we'll make some distance before dark." Tom nodded grimly. He could see the ocean was a bleak gray, streaked with floating ice. But it was freedom of a sort, or the promise of a swift death at sea, which might be better than the clutches of the dead. With considerable effort, they all piled aboard. Garen took the rudimentary tiller, while Tom hoisted the sail. Alice, still nursing the wounded woman, cast glances back at the shoreline. She half expected to see silhouettes cresting the ridge. But for once, no whites emerged. The battered sail caught the wind, and the boat lurched into deeper water. They navigated slowly, the hull creaking ominously with every small wave. The day wore on with a slate-colored sky, the sun a pallid disk behind swirling clouds. Occasionally, chunks of ice floated by, forcing Garen to steer wide. They were heading west, hugging the coastline for now, though that coast was little more than a jagged line of rock and snow. Tom worried that the slightest change in wind might drive them onto the cliffs. The hours passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the crack of ice against the hull and Maris's labored breathing. Brella never strayed far from Garen's side, as if trusting only the smuggler's battered confidence. By late afternoon, the coast fell behind a haze of sea mist. Alice turned to Tom and asked, "Which route will we take?" He had no sure answer. "South and east is the narrow sea. That's closer to Essos, but also closer to the largest concentration of whites, if the Night King marches those shores. West is the open Sunset Sea. Hardly anyone sails there, because they say it leads to nowhere," Garen added wryly, raising an eyebrow. Alice hunched her shoulders. Better nowhere than certain death. They chose to keep west, for the time being. Darkness would arrive soon enough, and they wanted to avoid reaching the southwestern shores near the remnants of the Reach or the Shield Islands after nightfall. Rumor had it the whites patrolled all major ports. Night crept in, an ink-black gloom above the waves. With no star to guide them, cloud cover was thick. They only had the wind and the uncertain line of the horizon. Garen remained at the tiller, eyes scanning for hazards. Tom sat near the bow, shivering under ragged furs, sword resting across his lap. Alice tried to keep Maris warm, feeding her sips of water when she stirred. Brella dozed fitfully against the mast. Then, in the small hours before dawn, something changed in the air. The wind hushed almost completely, leaving the boat adrift in an eerie calm. A light snow began to fall, flakes swirling out of the darkness. Garen frowned. "We're losing wind. The sea's flattening." He was correct. Waves became gentle ripples, and the sail, patched though it was, hung nearly limp. They drifted with the currents. Tom peered over the side, seeing reflections of gray sky in the water. "At least we're not crashing onto rocks," he said softly. But there was an unease to that stillness, an unnatural hush that reminded them of who ruled the land they'd left behind. Alice's attention snapped to Maris. The wounded woman's breath had turned shallow, rasping as she clutched her abdomen. "We need more fresh water," Alice said, gently feeling her forehead. The fever was rising. "She's burning up." "Use the melted snow if we can gather it," Tom suggested. But the air was so cold, the flakes barely melted on the deck BF. "We're freezing." Garen looked about. "We can rig something. A canvas catch. Let the snow gather." He rummaged for cloth, half a sail, anything that could collect precipitation. They improvised a shallow tarp, though the yield of melted water was pitifully small. All the while, Maris slid further into delirium. Sometimes she mumbled about being in Highgarden, dancing in the meadows under a golden sun. Other times she raved about the whites that had torn her friends apart on the roads. Alice tried to soothe her, pressing a damp cloth to her brow, but the woman's eyes flickered without recognition. Morning finally arrived, though that was a mere shift from black night to pallid gloom. In the dull light, the sea stretched in all directions, an endless silver gray, with broken ice floes drifting now and then. The coastline, if it still lay behind them, was lost in the haze. With no wind to push them onward, they bobbed aimlessly, at the mercy of unseen currents. Tom's jaws clenched. They had made their escape, if one could call it that, only to risk starvation and thirst at sea. "We need wind," he murmured. "Or a miracle." Alice, bleary-eyed, nodded. She glanced at Brella, who was curled in a corner, hugging her knees. "How are you faring, lass?" The girl did not speak. She simply stared over the side at the dark water. Garen rummaged through their supplies. "We've enough dried fish for maybe 3 days. After that, we'll have to try fishing or risk scouring any coastline we find. But if we land near White's—" He left the thought unfinished. A tense hush followed. It was broken by a faint, sputtering sound from Maris, as she struggled for breath. Alarmed, Alice crawled to the woman's side. The battered cloth over her abdomen was soaked through with fresh blood. "Gods," Alice whispered, panic stirring in her chest. "She's bleeding again." Tom knelt, trying to see if any pressure would help. The wound was deep, and the cold had slowed the bleeding at first, but now feverish shaking made it worse. Maris's eyes flickered open briefly. She grabbed Tom's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let me turn," she rasped, breath rattling in her chest. "Promise." Tom's face hardened, remembering all too well how the Night King's dominion spread. If she died from these wounds, would she rise as a white out here at sea? It seemed impossible, and yet they did not fully understand the reach of the White Walker's magic. The old tales said the Night King could resurrect any who died under his sky. The question was, did that sky include the waters far from shore? "We'll do what must be done," Tom said hoarsely. Maris's grip loosened, and her head lolled back. Her breathing went shallow, barely audible. They tried for hours to keep her alive, but by midday, her eyes closed for the final time. A hush fell over the boat. Brella's small fingers clenched in her cloak, face pale with shock. Alice brushed a hand across Maris's brow, feeling the last traces of warmth vanish beneath the unyielding cold. In the old world, they might have prepared a funeral pyre, offered last rites. But there was no wood to spare for burning a body, and no priest to speak words of farewell. Garen shot Tom a grave look. "We can't keep her aboard. If she changes—" They all understood. Even if the risk was small, they dared not keep the corpse on the boat. Their meager vessel was too cramped to fight a newly risen White, and they had no desire to watch the transformation if it came. With trembling hands, Tom searched Maris's belongings for any clue of her house or family, but found only a half-shredded sigil, unrecognizable, and a single gold ring shaped like a rose stem. He took the ring, intending to remember her by it, then wrapped the body in torn sailcloth. Alice and Tom lifted it gently over the side, letting her slip into the dark water. Brella turned away, pressing her face into Garen's shoulder. For a long moment, they watched the waves, waiting to see if anything unnatural happened. But there was only the hush of the sea. With sad relief, they turned away and resumed their silent vigil. The doldrums persisted. The boat drifted slowly, the sail sagging. When the meager sun began to dip, they realized they'd traveled so little distance that the horizon looked much the same as it had in the morning. Exhaustion gnawed at them. Hunger and thirst were equally pressing. That night, they rationed themselves a single sip of water each. On the second day adrift, something broke the monotony. A swirl of wind teased the sail. Garen scrambled to adjust the rigging, coaxing the boat into the faint breeze. They crept forward at a snail's pace, but it was enough to move. The lumps of ice grew scarcer. The temperature, though still brutally cold, felt a degree milder than in the far north. They glimpsed gulls overhead at midday, a sign that perhaps some vestige of normal life existed in this part of the sea. That gave them a sliver of hope. Birds meant fish, fish meant potential food, and maybe if birds nested on some rocky island, they could stop for fresh water. They continued westward, hearts pounding with each shift of the wind, terrified that it might die at any moment or turn savage, casting them onto the open ocean. On the fourth day, They spotted a blur on the horizon, an island of some sort. Brella actually lifted her head, silent but with eyes shining, as if she, too, felt the pull of land. Garin steered them closer. Soon they made out the jagged silhouette of cliffs and high bluffs. Gulls wheeled in the sky. Was it safe? Or had the dead come even here? Tentatively, they approached a narrow inlet. The rocky walls soared on either side, battered by waves. With care, they found a small cove that opened onto a beach of black pebbles. The surf crashed, echoing among the cliffs. No sign of movement, but that hardly guaranteed safety. They beached the boat, drew it high onto the stones, and listened. Nothing but the roar of the sea. Alice, sword in hand, climbed a slope of slippery rocks. Tom followed, shield readied. Garin and Brella remained by the boat, scanning for movement. Reaching the top of the small ridge, Alice saw a plateau of rocky ground dotted with sparse brush and a scattering of stunted trees. Some might be weirwoods gone wild, but from a distance it was hard to say. The island wasn't large, at least not this section. Further inland, it rose to a jagged peak. She turned to Tom, exhaling a cloudy breath. "It looks empty." "Empty might be a blessing," he answered. They spent the remainder of daylight exploring. To their muted joy, they discovered a small freshwater stream trickling down from the central peak to the beach. The water was cold and clear. All four of them drank greedily, filling any containers they had. It felt like a miracle after so many days of salt and meager melted snow. They also found scattered brush they could gather for firewood, though it was damp and required drying before it would burn well. Animal tracks, perhaps goats or some feral breed of sheep, led further inland, raising the possibility of fresh meat. The idea of it made Alice's stomach ache with longing. They made camp near the stream, feeling safer on land than drifting in the boat. Night fell swiftly, but the island remained quiet except for the wind rattling the scrub. No wights emerged from the dark. No undead dragon roared overhead. Even the temperature, while still cold, was more bearable than the northern storms. Gathered around a small fire, they allowed themselves a fragile sense of relief. Brella picked at the dried fish, eyes flicking shyly to the stream, as if enthralled by the simple marvel of fresh running water. Tom and Alice exchanged glances of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a place to shelter. Perhaps from here they could gather strength, decide on a plan to sail further south, or even attempt to build a better vessel. Over the next few days, they explored more thoroughly. The island was mostly barren rock, with patches of tough grass and a handful of gnarled trees. But there were goats, a small herd of them, skittish and swift. Tom managed to snare one, though he nearly fell off a ledge in the process. The fresh meat, roasted over a meager fire, was the finest thing any of them had tasted in ages. Brella actually gave a slight smile when she bit into the charred goat. It was the first real expression they'd seen on her face in weeks. Garin spent hours each morning scanning the sea for any sign of ships, undead or otherwise. He saw none. The sense of isolation was profound. Yet that isolation might be their salvation, so long as the Night King's dominion didn't extend to these parts. They had no illusions about the possibility of eventually returning to Westeros. The memory of wights on every road, dead dragons overhead, and entire kingdoms in ruin haunted them. But perhaps they could survive, hidden away from the endless winter. A moon's turn passed in a hazy sequence of foraging, fishing, and scouting. They found a small cave that offered better shelter than the open beach. Within that cave, they stored water and the salted goat meat. Alice fashioned crude spears from driftwood and sharpened rock for hunting. Tom rigged an alarm system using shells and rope at the cave entrance, just in case anything stalked them at night. Brella still did not speak, but she grew less timid, occasionally helping gather brush or washing the meager clothing they had in the stream. Sometimes she would stand at the shore, letting the wind tug at her dark hair, staring out at the horizon as if half expecting to see the wights appear on some ghost ship. They lived like that for a quiet stretch, days blending, nights passing in relative peace. Their battered boat rested in the same cove, pulled above the tidal line. The idea of traveling again remained an unspoken question. Why risk the sea if this place offered them life and anonymity? But the memory of the Night King was always there, an ache in the back of their minds. Stories told of how, in the ancient long night, the cold spread across entire continents. What if the unnatural winter eventually reached this island? Could they outrun it? Or would they freeze in these caves one day when the storms intensified? It was on a late afternoon, cool, damp, with a fog creeping inland, that everything changed. Alice and Tom had gone inland, hoping to gather more of the tough grasses they could braid into rope. Brella was at the cave entrance, presumably weaving fishing nets. Garen had ventured along the shore, scanning for driftwood. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed across the plateau. Not a woman's scream this time, but a man's. A startled, desperate sound. Alice and Tom paused in mid-step, hearts pounding. Who was that? Alice gasped. They hurried back toward the cove, cutting across rocky ground. As they crested a ridge, they saw Garen below, crouched behind a boulder, apparently hiding from something. And there, on the beach, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with gray hair and a cloak of battered leather. A sword hung at his side. He was not one of theirs, and he looked half dead from exposure. Two more huddled behind him, a man and a woman, both ragged, leaning on him for support. They were all breathing, alive. But that wasn't the only shock, because from the mouth of the cove, where the boat lay, emerged three reeling shapes. Whites. Alice's stomach dropped. Had the undead found them at last? How had these intruders and the whites arrived on this remote island at the same time? Her unspoken question was cut off as the whites lunged at the trio of strangers. The tall man swung his sword in a desperate arc, severing the arm of the lead white. But the thing kept coming, black lips pulled back in a silent snarl. The second white circled around, reaching for the other man. Tom's instincts took over. He sprinted forward, shouting, "Get down!" The tall man turned in surprise, eyes flicking to Tom. In that instant, Tom's battered longsword crashed into the second white's skull, splitting it with a crunch. A jolt of triumph shot through him, still killable. Alice, quick as a blade, thrust her spear at the third white, piercing its chest. That might not kill it, but it staggered, giving the tall stranger time to hack at its legs. The white collapsed, still twitching, until Tom drove his sword into its throat, severing the spine. The first white, missing an arm, latched onto the second man's cloak. He screamed, trying to wrench free. The tall stranger bellowed and plunged his sword into the white's back, but it refused to let go. Alice slammed her spear but into its head with a sickening crack. When it turned its milky eyes on her, she froze for a moment, remembering the legions that had poured over Winterfell. Ice crawled up her spine. She forced herself into motion again, twisting the spear blade to saw through the white's neck. Blackened flesh parted, and the head rolled free. At last, the body slumped. The entire skirmish took mere moments, but left everyone panting in the hush that followed. Three whites lay on the rocky beach, as truly still as corpses now. Blood, both old, dark fluid from the whites and bright red from the new arrivals, streaked the pebbles. Alice steadied herself, eyes scanning the cove. Garen emerged from behind his boulder, gaze wary. Brella stood further up the slope, hugging her arms. The tall stranger, sword arm shaking from exertion, stared at Tom and Alice. His face was gaunt, lined with exhaustion, but his eyes held a desperate relief. You killed them," he managed between ragged breaths. Tom swallowed. Hardly the first whites we've faced, but how did they get here? How did you get here?" The stranger's gaze flicked to the battered boat partially hidden behind a spur of rock. A small skiff disintegrating as if it had been wrecked. "We came on a half-broken boat," he said. "A wave dashed us into the rocks on the far side of the island. Those things washed ashore with us." The other man, younger and limping, collapsed to his knees, eyes haunted. "They were our companions," he gasped. "One died on the boat. Then she..." She rose. Alice's mouth went dry. So the whites had formed among them, reanimated as soon as they perished under the Night King's sky. That answered a grim question about how the dead could appear even here. The tall stranger steadied his trembling sword arm and nodded at them. "My name is Conwy. This is Bren, and that's Scylla." He gestured to the man on his knees and the woman with a badly bandaged leg. "We escaped the mainland." He let out a humorless laugh. "Or so we thought." Tom could hardly believe they were speaking to new living faces after so long. He gestured for them to follow. "Come, we have a small camp. We can tend your wounds. But we need to make sure none of you is bitten or infected." "We aren't," Conwy assured, though he promptly stumbled, nearly falling in the surf. Tom and Alice exchanged glances, then moved to support him. Scylla leaned on Alice, flinching every few steps, clearly in pain. Garen approached warily, his hand near the dagger at his belt, uncertain if these strangers posed a threat. Brella watched from a distance, her eyes full of silent fear. The presence of more living people meant unpredictability. Yet there was also a glimmer of something else in her expression, an unspoken longing, maybe, for the world they had lost. They led the newcomers to their cave. Firelight flickered on damp walls. Conwy, Bren, and Scylla explained their tale in hushed, broken voices while Alice and Tom heated water to clean their injuries. They had fled the Crownlands months ago, they said, traveling by foot across half the realm. Whites were everywhere, patrolling roads, sacking towns. They'd found a small boat among the wreckage of a port near the Blackwater, patched it, and tried to sail south. But storms had driven them west, and one of their party had died en route, only to rise within the cramped hull. In the ensuing struggle, they'd run aground on this island. 2 of their group were killed, reanimated, and had attacked them again. Listening, Garen shook his head in grim understanding. The Night King's magic holds all the lands in its grip. The sky is his domain. If you die beneath it, you rise. "We hoped the sea might break that," Bren said, voice quavering. "But it didn't. The moment Ilana died, she turned. A madness. We had to throw her overboard. That's when the boat cracked on some reef. We drifted for a day." The weight of their story pressed on everyone. Alice exchanged a look with Tom. So the plague was unstoppable, even out here. The question: did the whites that they just killed remain truly dead? Fire was the surest way to destroy them beyond reanimation, but they had precious little fuel to burn corpses. Eventually, they decided to drag the dismembered remains deeper inland, dumping them in a ravine. Tom insisted they watch for any sign of movement. None came. With the heads severed, the whites were presumably inert. Yet unease lingered like a ghost. Over the next days, the newcomers recovered somewhat in the cave's relative safety. Conwy proved to be a decent hunter, despite his battered condition, and with Tom's help, he managed to corner a small goat. Bren was quieter, haunted by what he'd seen, but he labored to gather brush and help expand their campsite. Scylla's leg injury was severe. Alice worried she might lose the limb to infection, but the fresh stream water and the meager supply of dried herbs Alice had found on the island gave them a fighting chance to clean it. And so the island's population of living souls grew to 7. Brella watched them all in silence, drifting on the margins. Garen remained guarded, reluctant to share supplies. Yet Conwy's group had brought a scattering of their own provisions, salted fish, a little barley, and they pooled resources. But as the days turned into weeks, conversations turned to the future. Could they remain indefinitely? Would more whites find them, drifting ashore on wrecked boats or crossing the sea in ways no one could predict? Late one evening, with the fire burning low, Conwy told them a rumor he'd heard in the Crownlands. Some said the Night King was unstoppable. He marched all the way to Dorne, to Storm's End, even to Old Town. But there was also an old myth that, in Essos, the Red Priests were gathering. Something about forging a new weapon of fire. They had done so in a past age, or so the stories went. Perhaps they planned to sail west and challenge him. No one looked convinced. Alice had grown up near the northern coasts. She had seen how easily the living were crushed when the Night King advanced. "No rumor saved Winterfell," she said quietly. "No rumor saved King's Landing." Conwy lowered his gaze. He had no retort. That night, Tom tossed and turned. Nightmares haunted him. Visions of whites scaling the cliffs of the island, of an undead dragon's shriek splitting the clouds. He woke sweating in the cold, his heart hammering. The cave was silent, except for the soft breathing of others. His mind wandered back to the battles for Winterfell, the hopeless last stands, the swirling snow stained red. He recalled the moment he'd seen Daenerys Targaryen fall, transformed by the Night King's chilling dominion. The memory still twisted his gut. He tried to remind himself that if the Mother of Dragons herself had failed, how could any ragtag group stand a chance? He rose, grabbing his cloak, and stepped outside. The moonlit night cast the rocky slopes in silver. Frost rimed the grasses, but it wasn't the deep freeze of the north. The sky overhead was clear, dotted with stars. He found high, himself scanning it, half expecting to see the ghastly shape of Viserion or some other undead creature crossing the moon. But the heavens were calm. In the distance, the sea murmured, and gulls croaked from some hidden ledge. By the time dawn approached, Tom was still awake, sitting on a rock near the stream, pondering the precariousness of their island refuge. A few days later, Scylla's fever broke, to everyone's relief. She managed to limp outside the cave, letting the ocean breeze wash over her. Her eyes were distant as she recounted the horrors of the Crownlands, how the farmland had withered beneath relentless cold, how entire families had turned to cannibalism before the whites arrived to finish them off. She spoke of the Golden Company's last stand, the wildfire that consumed half of King's Landing. She had been traveling with a small band of survivors for months before meeting Conwy and Bren. Bren, for his part, rarely slept. He told Garen in a hushed conversation how he had watched whites tear his father limb from limb near the Blackwater Rush. The father had reanimated, forcing Bren to destroy him a second time. These were not stories easily shared, but in the gloom of the cave, with flames dancing on the walls, they found a grim solace in recounting all they had lost. A shared sorrow was better than an isolated one. Over time, an unspoken consensus arose. Perhaps they would stay on the island for the indefinite future. They had goats, some small game, fish in the surrounding waters, and enough brush for limited fires. The climate was harsh, but not as lethal as further north. Maybe that was all they could hope for. They had found a pocket of the world unclaimed, at least temporarily, by the Night King's winter. Yet fate had a way of appending even the smallest hopes. One frigid dawn, Alice, who had woken early to forage along a goat trail, caught sight of something in the sky. First, she thought it a trick of light, a dark shape, far off, drifting above the water. She shaded her eyes. The shape seemed to move with ominous purpose, gliding in slow arcs. She hurried back to the cave and found Tom. "There's something in the sky, over the western horizon." Alarmed, Tom and Conwy climbed a ridge to look. Garen followed, leading Brella. Scylla and Bren remained behind, Scylla's legs still too weak for climbing. At the ridge's summit, they stared out to sea. The sky was a dull slate, the sunrise barely aglow behind the clouds. Sure enough, a silhouette drifted in the distance. Something winged. Tom's heart turned to ice. For a horrifying moment, he feared it was Viserion, the undead dragon, or some new monstrous drake in the Night King's service. But the shape was smaller, more awkward. It beat wide wings, though not with the unholy grace of an ice dragon. It seemed to circle, as if scouting the waters. He glanced at Conwy. "Do you think a wyvern? A giant bird?" Conwy shook his head, brow furrowed. "Not sure. But if it's some unnatural beast, we'd best hide." Garen was the first to hazard a guess. "A mantico? No, that's a child's tale from Essos. Perhaps it's just a large bird of prey." They watched, anxious, as the shape continued to circle for a time. Then, abruptly, it turned and flew east, disappearing behind the clouds. They exhaled, though tension still gripped them. The presence of any flying creature that large was suspect in this new world. If the Night King commanded it, or if it was drawn to the living, it might return. Over the next fortnight, they attempted to put that strange sight out of their minds. The routines of survival took precedence. Gathering enough food, ensuring Scylla's leg healed, keeping watch at night for any more drifting whites. But a nagging worry settled in their minds. If that creature had a rider or a master, word might spread that living souls occupied this island. One chilly afternoon, while tending small cooking fires near the cave, Conwy approached Tom with a grin set to his jaw. "We should consider fortifying," he said. "If there's a chance anything bigger than whites comes for us, like a White Walker or, gods forbid, the Night King himself, we'll have nowhere to hide." Tom, face lined with weariness, nodded. "We have so few resources. Rocks, some brush. We can't build walls that will stop the dead. And if an undead dragon arrives..." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Garen overheard and joined them. "If a dragon comes, we're done. But maybe we can at least hide ourselves from the White Walkers on foot." They discussed possibilities, blocking off the cove, building some sort of palisade at the cave entrance, or establishing a lookout at the highest peak. In the end, they decided on a watchtower of sorts, piling stones at a vantage point near the ridge to create a small shelter. One person could stay there on rotation, scanning the sea for trouble. Felt feeble, but it was better than waiting blindly for doom. The next day, they worked together hauling stones, building a rough waist-high ring on the ridge. It gave some protection from the wind. A battered spyglass from Conwy's wrecked skiff helped them see a little farther across the water. Brella helped carry smaller rocks, surprising Alice with her quiet determination. Though the girl never spoke, she contributed, shoulders set in the posture of someone who knew how fleeting every haven could be. Weeks blended. Then, early one morning, Bren, who stood watch, scrambled down from the ridge, nearly twisting his ankle in his haste. "A ship!" he gasped when he reached the cave mouth. "A real ship, big as any galley I've seen, out to the west." A jolt of fear and excitement shot through them all. A ship could mean rescue, or it could mean raiders. Or worse, a vessel of the dead, crewed by whites. They rushed up the ridge with the spyglass. Sure enough, a tall-masted ship loomed on the horizon. Black sails flapped in the stiff wind. It crept closer, heading toward the island's southern shore. Tom's mind raced. Could it be the Ironborn? But the sigils, if any, were impossible to make out at this distance. Or perhaps it was a pirate crew, or some Associ cell sail. Conwy frowned. If they're men, are they friend or foe? If they're whites, do the whites even sail? Old legends said the dead could walk under the sea. But the notion of them piloting a ship was more than chilling. Garen shook his head. "I've never heard of whites sailing like men, but we can't rule anything out." Scylla, leaning on a crude crutch, joined them with a grimace. "We should hide," she said. "Wait to see who comes ashore." They agreed to keep out of sight. If the ship moored and strangers landed, they would observe from a distance before deciding to reveal themselves. They scattered, some finding vantage points along the ridge, others hiding below. Through the spyglass, they watched the ship drop anchor off a sandy stretch on the island's southern coast. A small landing party rowed a longboat ashore. From the ridge, Tom counted 8 figures stepping onto the beach. They wore dark leathers and furs, though not the patchwork rags of simple survivors. Their posture looked disciplined, almost militaristic. Some carried crossbows, others swords. At their head was a tall woman with braided hair the color of midnight, a sword strapped across her back. A standard bearer walked behind, but the cloth was black as night, no emblem visible. Alice, crouched beside Tom, whispered, "Sellswords? Mercenaries?" Garen narrowed his eyes at the tall woman's posture. Could be the Ironborn, but they usually fly the Kraken. That's no Kraken banner. They watched the group move inland, scanning the terrain. One man bent to examine the goat tracks, another studied the horizon. They advanced with careful steps, as though expecting an ambush. At length, the woman raised a hand, and the party halted. Through the spyglass, Tom could see her speaking, but not hear the words. Then the group resumed progress toward the island's interior. They were heading in the direction of the plateau, and eventually the caves. Tension prickled across the watchers. Conwy whispered, "If they find the cave, we risk being cornered if they're hostile." Alice's hand clenched around her spear. "We might have to intercept them, or hide deeper in the island." But an idea sparked in Tom's mind, something that felt both reckless and necessary. "We can't just keep hiding forever," he said softly. "What if they're truly men and women of the living? We need allies. We need to learn what's happening beyond this island." Scylla's voice trembled. "Or they could kill us for our supplies." Tom's gaze flicked across the ragged group. They had so little, yet that little might still be precious in this world. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. "I'll go down to them," he said. "Alone, so they don't think an ambush. I'll see if they're friend or foe." Alice grabbed his arm. "You'll be killed if they aren't friendly." He met her gaze. "Then you'll know to hide or flee. But if they come upon us by surprise, we're all at risk. This way, at least, we can have some control." Conwy nodded reluctantly. "You're braver than me, Snow." Tom gave a wry half-smile. He hadn't used his surname in ages. He rarely spoke it since Winterfell's fall. "It's the only way." With that, he handed the spyglass to Alice and began descending the ridge, heart hammering. He moved toward the southern interior, skirting gullies and rocky paths. He hoped to approach the strangers from an angle that would let him see them first. He traveled carefully, clutching his sword's hilt. Each footstep seemed a thunderclap in his own ears. The wind carried the faint tang of salt. After a half hour, he spotted them through a gap in the rocks. They had formed a loose perimeter near a cluster of boulders. The tall woman was conferring with two men who wore short cloaks and crossbows. Mustering his courage, Tom sheathed his sword but kept a hand near it. Then he stepped out into the open, raising an arm in a gesture of peace. "Hail!" he called, voice echoing across stone. At once, crossbows snapped up. The tall woman spun, sword half-drawn. "Who goes there?" Her voice rang, resonant and commanding. Tom swallowed. "A living man," he called back. "With living friends. We seek no quarrel. We are survivors, as I hope you are too." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the woman gestured, and her men lowered their crossbows, slightly. She approached Tom, boots crunching on pebbles. Up close, he saw that her dark hair was threaded with silver in places, her face set in lines of caution. She wore thick leathers reinforced with metal studs. "We are living," she said, scanning his face. "Who are you?" He exhaled. "I'm Tom. Tom Snow of the North originally." Her sharp eyes flicked over his battered furs, the scars on his arms. "Of the North? Then you've seen the Night King." He nodded, "and nearly died to his whites 100 times over." She studied him for a moment more. Then, with a curt nod, she motioned her men to stand down. "My name is Captain Morna. We're not part of any Westerosi house, nor do we fly a lord's banner. We hail from Essos. Our mission is complicated." Tom's heart thumped. Essos. So the rumors of gatherings there might hold some truth. "What brings you to a lonely island in the Sunset Sea?" Morna's eyes darkened. "We're scouting. Searching for—" She paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then, "For something that might break the winter's grip. We were told to search out any pockets of survivors, glean any knowledge of the White Walkers we could." Tom could hardly believe his ears. "So there are efforts in Essos? Movements against the Night King?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes, various factions, though we're not united. The Red Priests, the Magisters of Volantis, certain mercenary companies, even some in Karth. We do not all share the same plan, but we share a single enemy." A faint spark of hope fluttered in Tom's chest, hope he had thought extinguished. "We have more survivors with us. 7 of us in total. If you truly are allies, we'd welcome any chance to fight back." Morna studied him with a guarded expression. "Fight back is a strong phrase. Survive might be more apartment. But yes, take me to your camp. Tom nodded, relief and anxiety mingling. He led them back toward the plateau, ensuring his posture remained non-threatening. Morna signaled for 3 of her men to remain behind, presumably to secure the approach, while she and 4 others followed Tom. They arrived at the cave to find the rest of Tom's group half hidden behind boulders and outcroppings, weapons at the ready. Conwy stood in front, sword drawn, while Alice perched in an elevated spot, spear in hand. Garen and Scylla waited at the cave mouth, tension etched on their faces. Brella lingered behind them, all but invisible. Tom raised a hand. They're not whites or bandits. Hear them out. Morna sized up the group. She nodded at Conwy. We've no quarrel with you. We come from Lys. Our ship belongs to a private fleet that's forging alliances across the seas. Alice lowered her spear, though not entirely. Why here? Morna's lips thinned. We've scouted many of the western coasts. The plague of whites is spreading further than we anticipated. We landed here to see if it was inhabited, or if we might find any clue about the White Walkers' doings. Her gaze flicked to the rocky terrain. We found you. That's all. Cautiously, they invited the newcomers to share their fire. Over time, the tension eased, especially when Morna's men produced a bit of brandy to warm everyone's spirits. They talked late into the evening, swapping tales. Tom's group described their flight from Winterfell or King's Landing or the Crownlands, how they ended up shipwrecked or adrift on this lonely isle. Morna explained that in Essos, rumors of the Night King's conquest had unsettled many city-states. The Red Priests in Volantis were convinced the only salvation lay in a prophesied champion of R'hllor, one who never came. Others pinned hopes on forging alliances with any Targaryen loyalists, though that line seemed extinguished when Daenerys fell. She cast a significant look at Tom. You say you fought at Winterfell. Did you see the moment the Night King overcame the dragons? Tom's throat tightened. Yes, he said. Viserion, the undead dragon, killed Drogon in mid-battle. Rhaegal had already perished. Daenerys. He closed his eyes, forcing down the memory. She was lost. Morna nodded grimly. In Essos, some still cling to the rumor that Daenerys Targaryen might be alive. They speak her name as if she'll return with fire and blood. But it seems you have truth, and it's not the news they want. Tom managed a bitter half-smile. If she lives, it's only as part of the Night King's thrall. Silence reigned. Even Morna's men, hardened as they were, looked disturbed. Eventually, Morna changed the subject. We'll depart soon, but if any of you wish to sail with us, we can offer passage east. Our superiors are rallying an enclave in Lys. Scholars, alchemists, fighters. Maybe from that union we can glean a way to oppose the White Walkers, or at least fortify Essos in case the winter spreads further. Conwy's eyes flicked with interest. Scylla inhaled sharply. Even Garen looked torn, scowling at the cave floor. This was a chance to rejoin civilization, if civilization existed. But it was also a risk, leaving a place they'd made marginally safe. Tom glanced at Alice. She returned his look, shoulders tense. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a longing for more than just scraping by on goats and drifting fish. Might be our only real hope, she murmured. Brella, from her corner, gazed at them with wide, silent eyes. She had only known flight and horror. What would it mean to board another ship, cross the seas again? That night, the group conferred among themselves. Morna and her men slept under watch outside, respectful of boundaries. Conwy, Scylla, and Bren were inclined to go, seeing it as a chance for meaning and not mere survival. Garen hesitated. He had a smuggler's distrust of any official operation, but was not blind to the dangers of staying. Alice was torn. This island had given them a quiet life, but it was always precarious. She feared whites might arrive in greater numbers or that an undead dragon would find them eventually. Tom felt a strange stirring of responsibility. He had led them this far in a sense. He could not decide alone, but it weighed on him that if they went, it might condemn them to new dangers. If they stayed, they might slowly starve or be discovered anyway. They took a vote of sorts, wholly informal, just a matter of each speaking their mind. In the end, all but Brella voiced that they should go with Morna. Brella, too young to weigh such a decision, simply stared at her feet. But the others decided on her behalf. If they went, they would not abandon the girl. At dawn, they informed Morna of their decision. She received it with a curt nod. "Very well. My ship, the Duskfeather, awaits. We'll set sail within 2 days. Gather all you can. We have limited cargo space, but supplies are always welcome." 2 days of hectic preparation followed, overshadowed by the knowledge that leaving meant trusting Morna's men fully. They butchered a few goats for salted meat, smoked whatever fish they could, and stored fresh water in barrels Morna provided. They found crates in her longboat to pack meager personal belongings. Scylla tested her leg, wincing but able to stand. Brella was quiet, though she helped tie bundles of dried grasses that might serve as tinder. When the final moment came, they waded into the surf with Morna's crew, loading the longboat. Brella clung to Alice's arm, watching as the island's narrow beach receded behind them. The rest of the group wore expressions of mixed relief and sorrow. This had been their haven, if a lonely, precarious one. The longboat cut through choppy waves until they reached the Duskfeather, a sleek but weathered vessel with tall masts and black sails. Morna's men worked the riggings expertly, helping the newcomers on board. The deck smelled of tar and old brine. Crew members eyed the new arrivals with caution. Some nodded or murmured greetings. Before the sun set, the anchor was raised, the sails unfurled, and the Duskfeather caught the wind, carving a path eastward across the sunset sea. Tom and his companions found places to sleep in cramped quarters below deck. Captain Morna assigned them tasks: mending sails, swabbing decks, standing watch in the crow's nest. There was no room for idlers on a ship that needed all hands. Days turned into a pattern of labor and worry. Morna revealed that they planned to skirt the southern coasts of Westeros, hopefully avoiding direct contact with the Whites. If the route held, they would eventually pass the Broken Arm near Dorne, where the ocean currents might let them slip into the summer sea and then across to Essos. But the flight from Westeros was hardly guaranteed. Whites could lurk in any port, and storms could drive them ashore. The night before they drew near the southwestern tip of the continent, Morna gathered the newcomers on the quarterdeck. Starlight glimmered overhead, the sea a dark expanse below. "We'll see if the rumors hold, that the seas near Dorne are partially frozen, or that the White Walkers have conjured storms. We might face monstrous winds. Are you prepared to fight for your lives?" Conwy managed a grim smile, hand on his hilt. "We fought for our lives in the north, the Crownlands, and an island. Another fight changes nothing." Tom nodded. "Whatever comes, we'll face it." Morna seemed satisfied, though her eyes glinted with tension. "Pray to any gods you have, then." Sure enough, as they ventured south, the climate remained unnaturally cold. Icicles clung to the rigging, and freezing fog swirled on the water each morning. Yet for a time, no Whites appeared. They saw deserted shorelines in the distance, occasionally glimpsed toppled lighthouses or wrecked ships. The sense of desolation was vast. Then came the 8th day after leaving the island. A storm closed in, the sky black with churning clouds. Thunder rumbled, lightning cracked in jagged forks. The wind whipped the sails, forcing the crew to scramble. Rain pelted the deck, mixed with sharp sleet. Morna's voice boomed, "Reef the sails! Secure the lines!" Tom, Alice, and the rest labored among the crew, adrenaline surging. Gusts threatened to tear the rigging loose. Waves slammed the hull, drenching them in freezing spray. The entire world seemed a chaos of thunder and swirling ice. In the thick of it, Bren, who had climbed the rigging to secure a sail, shouted down over the roaring wind, "Something in the water, port side!" Morna peered through the storm, trying to see. Another lightning flash illuminated a shape in the waves, a half-sunken vessel drifting ominously close. Even from a distance, it was clear the deck was swarming with figures, arms upraised. Whites, scores of them, half-submerged, clinging to broken masts or tangled nets. as if waiting to latch onto any passing ship. The Duskfeather heaved, precariously near a collision course. "Hard starboard," Morna roared. The helmsman wrestled the wheel, cursing as a wave crashed overhead. Tom's stomach churned. If they hit that wreck or drifted too close, the whites would swarm them. He glimpsed pale faces in the strobing lightning, gaunt, rotted. Their arms reached with mindless hunger. The Duskfeather angled away, but not enough. The hull scraped along the submerged remnants of the other ship, timbers splintering. A sickening lurch flung several crew members to the deck. A pair of whites latched onto the rails, hauling themselves upward. They clawed with bony fingers, eyes glowing with that deathly blue. "All hands, repel boarders," Morna bellowed, her sword gleaming in the flicker of lightning. The next instant, she swung it in a savage arc, cleaving a white from shoulder to hip. Another crewman jabbed a spear at the second white, but it grabbed the spear's shaft, yanking the man forward. Tom and Alice rushed to help. Tom slashed the white's elbow, severing the arm. Alice battered its skull with a hammer she'd seized from the deck. The thing tumbled overboard with a guttural hiss. But more clung to the wreck, and the waves threatened to smash the two vessels together again. Splinters of wood speared out from the battered side, ripping at the hull. Crew members scrambled to patch or brace the breach. Lightning revealed the entire deck of the ghostly ship. Perhaps 20 whites, all thrashing in the raging sea, some crawling along what remained of the deck, others entangled in netting. The eyes of each white glowed with uncanny malice. The storm made them even more nightmarish, rain lashing their dead flesh. With a tremendous effort, the helmsman managed to steer the Duskfeather free of the wreck's hold. The current tore them apart, leaving a gaping hole in the starboard side of Morna's ship. Water began rushing in. "Bail! Bail!" someone shouted. Buckets were passed in frantic succession. "Plug that breach," Morna ordered. Planks and tar were slapped across the hole. Tom and Conwy hammered nails with numb fingers. The ship listed dangerously, but after desperate minutes, the worst leaks were sealed. The storm hammered them mercilessly, waves crashing over the bow. Somehow, the Duskfeather forged on, battered but afloat, leaving the white-infested wreck behind. Morna and her men roared as they fought the wheel and sails. Thunder boomed. The wind howled. Eventually, the storm began to ebb. The sea's fury diminished, waves growing less violent. Dripping and exhausted, the crew took stock. A handful had minor injuries, bruises, cuts, a broken wrist. The tar patch held, though the hull was weakened. The drowned whites had claimed none of them, thanks to quick action. Perhaps that was a small miracle. As dawn broke, gray light revealed a battered horizon. The southwestern corner of Westeros lay behind them, a stretch of coastline receding into haze. They were effectively entering the summer sea, though it felt no warmer. Ice floes and swirling snow marred the water. Morna stood at the helm, knuckles white. She exhaled as if shedding the night's terror. "If that's the worst we face, we might still make it to Lys," Garen, rubbing a sore shoulder, muttered. "If the sea's full of white-haunted wrecks, we might face worse yet." No one disagreed, but they pressed on. Days of uneasy travel followed. They saw more ghost ships in the distance, derelicts drifting aimlessly, sometimes with whites visible on deck. Each time, Morna gave them a wide berth. They navigated by the sun, stars, and the rumors that the summer sea was less encroached upon by the long night. Gradually, the icebergs diminished, the water temperature rose a fraction, and the biting cold wind grew less insistent. Yet the gloom in the sky never fully lifted. Clouds hung heavy, as though the sunlight were rationed. They glimpsed barren islands that might once have been trade points near Dorne's southwestern coast. Empty beaches, a few broken piers, no sign of living souls. Eventually, as their water barrels ran low, Morna declared they had to land somewhere. "We need fresh supplies, or we'll perish before Essos," she said curtly. "There's an old port called Vulture's Roost on the southern coast, if the maps hold true. It might be deserted, but maybe we'll find wells or a functioning freshwater spring." A day later, the Duskfeather navigated toward a bay where rocky cliffs rose on either side. Once, a watchtower might have stood guard at the entrance. They saw only rubble. The tide was calm enough to sail in slowly. Morna posted archers on deck in case of white ambush. They found a small harbor, half collapsed, the docks sagging under the weight of neglect. Fog draped the shoreline. No movement. Carefully, they dropped anchor, lowering 2 longboats. Tom, Alice, Conwy, and a few of Morna's men formed one landing party. Morna and others took the second. They rowed to the docks, weapons drawn, scanning the gloom. It appeared deserted, yet they all knew appearances meant little in a realm under the Night King's shadow. The remains of old storehouses stood in the gloom, shuttered windows broken out. The group advanced cautiously. They heard only the low sigh of wind. Then, out of a narrow alley, a lone figure emerged. A man, bearded, eyes sunken from hunger. The group froze, half expecting a White's empty stare. But he staggered forward on living legs, holding out empty hands. "Water, please," he croaked, voice trembling. Tom and Alice exchanged glances, hearts clenching at the sight of another desperate survivor. Morna moved in with her men, scanning the alley for threats. Conwy offered the man a small flask. He drank greedily, coughing. "Are there others?" Morna asked him. He nodded weakly. "A handful. We've been hiding in the old holdfast, waiting for the storms to pass. There's no food. Many died. Others left, heading east." Morna's jaw set. "Lead us to them." He did so, stumbling across broken cobblestones. A few more survivors emerged. 3 women, 2 men, haggard and starving, huddled around a splintered brazier. They gaped at the sight of armed newcomers, at Morna's black-clad crew. Hope and fear mingled in their hollow eyes. Morna signaled her men to distribute some bread and water, though their own stores were limited. "We need to fill barrels," she told the survivors. "Where's the nearest well or spring?" A ragged woman gestured to a courtyard behind the holdfast. "It's nearly dry, but sometimes water seeps in if you wait." With caution, the landing party tested the water. Conwy found it brackish but still usable if boiled. They began filling barrels. Meanwhile, Tom and Alice asked the survivors about the region's condition. The answers were grim. Whites had ransacked the port a month earlier, leaving few alive. They had moved on, possibly heading north or east. But no one knew if or when they might return. The Night King's storms had battered the coastline, leaving the place half submerged at high tide. Hearing all this, Morna asked if any survivors wished to sail with them. Most were too weak or too terrified to believe in rescue. A few clutched at the offer, eyes desperate for escape. Eventually, 3 decided to join, the rest insisting they'd rather stay in the only place they knew, half resigned to starve or freeze. By afternoon, the group was returning to the longboats with newly filled barrels and the 3 survivors. As they neared the docks, Scylla, who'd remained behind on the Duskfeather, shouted across the water, "Look! Over there!" All eyes turned. On a far ridge above the harbor, where a half-collapsed tower jutted from the cliffs, a line of silhouettes stood. Tall, silent shapes, each carrying weapons that gleamed with a dull sheen. White walkers. A hiss went through the landing party. Morna barked for them to hurry. They scrambled into the longboats, pushing off from the docks. The silhouettes did not move at first, only stared down with glowing blue eyes. Then, as the longboats rowed frantically toward the Duskfeather, the White Walkers raised spears or swords of ice. A swirling wind picked up, carrying a bitter chill. "Row, row," Morna urged, fear taut in her voice. The White Walkers, only a handful in number, remained on the cliff, but an entire legion of whites could be behind them. The swirling wind grew into a small storm, as if called forth by the others. Waves crashed violently, rocking the longboats. Lightning flickered in the roiling clouds overhead. For a moment, Tom glimpsed the White Walkers' forms vanish into the swirling snow. Whether they advanced or held their ground, he couldn't tell. All he knew was they had to reach the ship. They did, battered and breathless, hauling the new survivors onto the deck. The dusk feather cast off at once, sails flapping in the rising gale. The crew wrestled with lines, cursing the sudden squall. But with skilled seamanship, they managed to maneuver out of the harbor. The watchers on the cliff vanished in the sheets of wind-blown sleet. Hours later, the ship emerged from the storm, drifting into calmer waters. Morna stood by the helm, expression grim. "We have fresh water," she said quietly, "and a few more souls, but the White Walkers are here in the southern coasts. The Night King's power runs deeper than we guessed." Tom's group gathered, each shivering with adrenaline and cold. 1,000 questions churned through their minds. Where exactly was the Night King now? How close was his unstoppable winter to Essos? Could anything truly stand against him if White Walkers roamed so far south? Morna exhaled. "We sail east until we glimpse the Basilisk Isles, then north toward Lys. Let us pray the route is open." The next weeks tested them further, but the sea grew warmer, and the storms of ice receded at last. They passed distant shapes of islands that had once been pirate dens. Their crew labored daily to keep the battered ship afloat, patching the hull, rationing supplies. The handful of new survivors from Vulture's Roost huddled in corners below deck, traumatized by how swiftly their rescue had come, and how swiftly the White Walkers had reappeared. Finally, the day arrived when they spotted the faint haze of landmass to the east, the sun's rays breaking more fully through the clouds. Lys, an island city off the coast of Essos, glimmered in the distance. A coastline of gentle slopes, dotted with old towers and the famed pleasure domes of a city that once thrived on trade. Tom stood at the prow with Alice, Conwy, Scylla, Bren, Brella, and Garen. They gazed at the unfamiliar city-state, hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Morna had told them Lys was still free of the White Walkers, heavily guarded and allied with other Essosi powers. If that was true, then they might find respite here, maybe even the beginnings of a plan to fight back. As the dusk feather glided closer, they observed the Lysini port bristling with defensive measures. Tall sea walls, ballistae aimed seaward, were galleys patrolling the bay. It was a far cry from the lifeless ports of Westeros. People, living, breathing people, moved about the docks, though they seemed on high alert. Banners in myriad colors fluttered on parapets. The sight was almost overwhelming after so much ruin and emptiness. Morna guided the ship toward an assigned quay, exchanging signals with a harbor official. Once they were moored, the group disembarked onto stone piers that rang with the clamor of voices, ropes, and wagons. Soldiers in half-armor patrolled, eyeing them with suspicion. Lysini port inspectors demanded to see Morna's credentials, suspicious that any new arrival from the west might bring plague or white curses. At length, Morna convinced them to let her group pass. "We serve House Delino's contract," she muttered to the officials, brandishing scrolls sealed with wax. That name must have carried weight, because the inspectors let them through, albeit grudgingly. And so Tom and his battered friends found themselves walking the wide cobbled streets of Lys, overshadowed by tall houses painted in pastel hues, carved with exotic designs. Perfumed scents drifted from pleasure houses, though the city's mood was subdued by the looming threat from across the sea. Signs were posted in corners, offering bounties for skilled fighters or for ancient knowledge that might help ward off the White Walkers. The entire city seemed on a war footing, uneasy but still alive. At Morna's urging, they followed her to a large compound near the southwestern edge of Lys, enclosed by high walls. "This is the seat of the War Council," she explained quietly. "A coalition, Sellsword captains, red priests, wealthy Lysini magisters, meets here to decide how best to fortify Essos." The gates parted, allowing them inside. Within lay a courtyard bustling with an unlikely mix. Soldiers in Essosi garb, priests wearing the red robes of R'hllor, merchants haggling over crates of supplies, and battered refugees from across the known world. The air hummed with urgency. Tom, Alice, and the others exchanged looks of awe and confusion. They had come from a dead land, a realm of hushed snow and whites. This was like stepping into a dream. No, more of a frenzied waking reality where the living still clung to hope. Morna led them deeper into the compound, eventually reaching a chamber lined with braziers. There, around a heavy table, a half-dozen figures were in the midst of heated discussion. A red priestess with fiery eyes, a Lysini magister swathed in silks, a lean Bravosi Cell's word captain with a curved blade. The argument ceased as Morna approached. One of them, a man with iron-gray hair and a face scarred by burns, looked up. He wore partial plate armor hammered in an unfamiliar style. "Back at last, Morna? Did you find anything?" She nodded, then gestured to Tom and his friends. "I found survivors, and the White Walkers are further south than we hoped. But these folk have knowledge of Westeros, the fall of Winterfell, the battles in King's Landing." She paused. "They've seen the Night King's devastation firsthand." The older man's expression tightened. He scanned Tom, Alice, Conwy, Scylla, the rest, reading the lines of suffering on their faces. "You're from the other side of the sea, then. You must have stories we need to hear." Tom stepped forward, swallowing his nerves. "We do," he said, voice resonating in the hush. "And if you're gathering a force to fight back, we'll give you all the knowledge we have." The red priestess's eyes flickered like embers. "We will have need of your accounts," she said, her voice thick with the accent of Volantis. "We gather every shard of lore that might lead us to a new Lightbringer, a new champion against the darkness. Our faith was shaken when Daenerys Targaryen fell, but the Lord of Light has not abandoned us." Alice looked uncertain, but she nodded softly. They had come so far, abandoned their quiet island in search of any glimmer that the Night King's tyranny might not be absolute. Whether by prophecy or by armed struggle, by sorcery or siege, perhaps these Essosi powers could mount a stand. The scarred man gestured to seats by the table. "Sit, tell us everything. Let us piece together a strategy to save what remains of the living world." They sat, still trembling from exhaustion, telling the tale of how the Night King crushed the combined armies at Winterfell, how the dragons fell, how King's Landing burned beneath wildfire and whites. Every sorrowful detail poured out: Arya's failed strike, Jon Snow's last stand, Bran's demise, the downfall of House Stark, House Targaryen, House Lannister, and so many others. The council listened in grim silence, some faces going pale, others tightening with rage or despair. When they finished, the Bravosi Cell's word captain cursed softly. The Lysini magister closed his eyes in dread. The red priestess murmured a prayer to Lawler. All illusions of Westeros as a mere rumor or distant conflict were shattered by this first-hand account. At length, the scarred man spoke. "We do not yet know if the White Walkers can cross the narrow sea in force, or if the entire ocean might freeze in time. But we do know they are unstoppable in open warfare. Our best hopes lie in forging alliances across all Essos. Mere mercenary companies cannot stand alone. We need the power of the Red Temple, the cunning of the Faceless Men, the ships of Volantis, the gold of Karth, perhaps even the sorcery rumored in Ass High." Morna looked at Tom and his companions. "Will you stand with us? We can't promise success, but it is better than waiting for the ice to come." A hush fell. Conwy, Scylla, Bren, each gave a resolute nod. They'd lost so much. The chance to fight back was a cause bigger than themselves. Garen, with a smuggler's practicality, shrugged. "I've nowhere else to be. Might as well spit in the devil's eye." Alice squeezed Tom's hand. "I'd fight," she said, "if there's even a sliver of hope." Brella, silent all this time, stared at the floor. Then, in a raspy, barely audible voice, her first words in what felt like an eternity, she whispered, I'll stay with you." They looked at her in stunned silence, hearts twisting. The child had finally spoken. Tom nodded slowly, tears pricking his eyes. "We stand together," he said. The red priestess's eyes flared with a strange intensity. "Then let us begin. We have scrolls of ancient prophecy to consult, watchers posted along the coast, spies in Westeros, what remains of it. We must find if there is any hope of forging a champion, or some magical means to break the Night King's hold. If not, all the world will join Westeros in endless winter." Thus, In a city far from the broken spires of King's Landing or the frozen walls of Winterfell, the fight for life continued. The memories of the dead land across the sea weighed heavily on all who had escaped it. Yet in these dark corridors, among uncertain alliances and fledgling war councils, a new story stirred, one of defiance, of souls willing to challenge the unstoppable night. Perhaps it would end in ruin as well, or perha. P.S. In some miracle not yet foreseen, the living would wrest the dawn from the jaws of a second long night. For Westeros it was too late. The Night King reigned there, enthroned in perpetual winter. But as the battered survivors from the fallen continent whispered their tales to rapt listeners, something flickered in the hearts of Essos, an ember of resistance. Whether that ember would become a flame strong enough to banish the cold tyranny remained unknown. Yet in a world overshadowed by the hush of endless snow, even the faintest spark could kindle desperate hope. And so they prepared. Every sword that could be forged, every scrap of lore that could be deciphered, every fragile alliance that could be brokered. These meager weapons formed the best defense left to humanity. If the Night King ever set his gaze fully eastward, they would need every ounce of cunning and courage to stave off oblivion. That night, Tom and Alice left the council chamber, hearts pounding with the immensity of it all. Outside, the stars hung in a warmer sky than any they'd known for months, maybe years. The city lights glimmered below them, a mosaic of flame and hope. They stood on a balcony overlooking the Lyseni rooftops, letting the sea breeze wash over them. Brella hovered nearby, the faint shadow of tears on her cheeks, as if too overwhelmed by the swirl of voices and possibilities. Alice placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We may never reclaim Winterfell," she murmured, "but we can try to save whatever world remains." Tom gazed eastward, where new storms might gather, or perhaps a dawn would break. "The living will not yield without a final stand," he said. Then they turned back inside to share what they knew, to plan, and to hope. For even in a land overshadowed by an ancient terror, so long as a single heart still beat with defiance, the future was not entirely sealed. The echoes of the Night King's triumph reverberated across oceans, but in that echo, the living found a reason to fight on. If they failed, the hush of eternal winter would claim Essos too, then the rest of the known world. But if they succeeded, perhaps they could avenge all who had fallen at Winterfell, at King's Landing, at every stronghold that now lay frozen and silent beneath the Night King's gaze. Thus, the story continued, no longer merely the saga of a lost kingdom, but a broader tale of survival, alliances, and a last, desperate bid to restore the dawn in a world devoured by the night. And though the final outcome remained uncertain, the ember of human resolve glowed fiercer for having come so close to extinction. If any force in creation could rival the inevitability of death and ice, it was that indomitable spark in mortal hearts, a spark that refused to be extinguished even in the darkest winter.